morning, friends. I talk a lot in my writing and in my preaching about ancestors. Ancestors are an important part of my theology and my practice. And I imagine that when I talk about ancestors, my ancestors, most people imagine that I am talking about someone who looks like me. This morning, I am inviting you to imagine our shared Unitarian ancestors, the Transcendentalists. And you might be wondering, because when I told people I was preaching about the Transcendentalist, many of them wondered to me aloud, what do Transcendentalists have to do with me? A bunch of privileged white New Englanders traipsing off into the woods to commune with nature, withdrawing from society, spreading this ideology of individualism. What I want to tell you is don't sleep on the Transcendentalists. I bet they have more to teach us than you think, and probably have more in common with you than you realize. While today, we herald the New England Transcendentalists as heroes, as fathers and mothers, mostly fathers of our faith. In their own day, they were most definitely not heroes. In Unitarian communities, the Transcendentalists were fringe at best. Their ideas were considered by many to be extreme. These youngsters, they were youngsters, were upstart radicals who challenged church authority. They questioned the fundamentals of church dogma and teaching, instead, championing free thought and self-determination. They sought a faith that would be more real, more relevant to their own lives. Transcendental, because they longed for something more transcendent, a more transcendent experience beyond the mundane details of human life, and especially beyond a dry and tedious rationality. Instead, they yearned for a more spiritual connection, a more direct connection to the divine. And as with any movement, Transcendentalists were not always of one mind, but together, they introduced new ways of thinking about one's relationship to self, one's relationship to community, and one's relationship to God that continue to inspire and to challenge us today. Among those who you might be most familiar with is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson was the old man of the bunch in his 30s. His early career was as a teacher and later a Unitarian minister. He would probably be considered not a very successful minister. He resigned from his first post after only 3.5 years. By all accounts, he was well liked by the congregation, but Emerson felt stifled by church teachings. He had real problems with church rites, such as communion. Despite his falling out with the church, he remained a popular essayist and lecturer. When he was 33, he published the essay Nature, which set forth some of the foundational viewpoints of Transcendentalism. Emerson argued that God is best encountered not in a stuffy church, listening to boring sermons about your Unitarian ancestors, but instead, out in nature, God, Emerson argued, is revealed to us in the beauty and perfection of the natural world. We have only to remove ourselves from the oppressive noise and busyness, the distractions of society. But it's this next thing that marks Emerson as the true Unitarian iconoclast. In 1838, Emerson is invited to deliver the commencement address for Harvard Divinity School. This is the seat of Unitarianism. His controversial speech set off a firestorm, a kind of line in the sand between an old guard and a new generation of thinking. In his speech to a class of new Unitarian ministers, their professors, and local clergy, Emerson argued against religious superstition and dogma. He discounted miracles. He questioned why we even need to be teaching that in the first place. He contested the importance of scripture, instead privileging direct spiritual experience. He called out lifeless and uninspiring preaching. Emerson advised that religion, real religion, need not be mediated by a preacher, but could be better developed through one's own intuition. Needless to say, this did not go over well in a room full of clergy. Emerson was denounced by the leadership of the day. But rather than retreat or apologize or look for some conciliatory common ground, Emerson doubles down. 3 years later, he publishes Self-Reliance. Emerson argues that institutionalized religion only hinders our ability to grow spiritually, mentally, as individuals. He encourages us to free ourselves from the constraints of conventional society, replacing the laws of humans with the laws of nature. He stressed instead individualism, personal responsibility, nonconformity. This theme of individualism follows Emerson and runs deep in our contemporary understanding of Unitarian Universalism. Emerson argued that we are each keepers of truth. We are each our own authority. Even in his own day, Emerson's contemporaries warned of the dangers of this line of thinking, taken to an extreme conclusion. Fellow Transcendentalist Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, for example, warned that Emerson's stress on self-reliance and individual fulfillment could lead to what she called ego theism, a kind of reverence of the self as God. Similarly, his young contemporary Carolyn Healy Dahl expressed concerns about Emerson's self-centered views. She described them as extravagant and unsafe. Many of Emerson's contemporaries tempered their exploration of the self with a commitment to the community, and more importantly, a commitment to their understanding of the common good. We can see more clearly how transcendentalist thought translated to one's relationship to community through Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau may be best remembered for his stint at Walden Pond and his subsequent book, Walden. Thoreau spent 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days at a remote cabin on Walden Pond as an experiment in simplicity in nature. The 29-year-old Thoreau attempted to live out transcendentalist thinking alone in the woods, where God and his very self might be revealed to him in nature. But Thoreau's was not an isolated life of self-reflection, divorced from worldly concerns. It was during his time at Walden that Thoreau wrote his essay, Civil Disobedience. A lifelong abolitionist, Thoreau had long ago stopped paying his taxes in protest against the institution of slavery. When Thoreau publicly condemned the US invasion and occupation of Mexico, viewing the whole endeavor as not only an example of American imperialism, but also as a plot by Southerners to expand slavery in the Southwest. He was arrested by the sheriff for tax evasion. Thoreau only spent one night in jail. He was released the next day when someone, probably his aunt, paid his taxes against his wishes. Thoreau argued that it was not enough to silently and righteously oppose slavery and war. One needed to be more engaged. He reasoned that if government tries to require us to obey unjust laws, people of conscience have a responsibility to break the law. Unlike Emerson, who advocated for a remove from the distraction of society, Thoreau and other more socially active transcendentalists drew a connection between self-examination and one's relationship to community. They understood that the personal moral development needed to be put to some purpose beyond individual righteousness. What, after all, is the point of being a good and just person if the world around you is consumed in the decay of injustice? And so this relationship between self and community is rounded out by a relationship to God, a new kind of Trinity. Though the Transcendentalists had real questions about Christian dogma, they did not question God. In fact, their questions and challenges to dogma and scripture and tradition and authority were precisely because they believed that these things keep us from a more true, more real, more relevant relationship with God. Whether that God is imagined as a benevolent father or the law of nature. When Thoreau was near the end of his life, his Aunt Louisa asked him if he had made peace with God. To which Thoreau replied famously, "I didn't know we had ever quarreled." This transcendentalist trinity between self and community and God is well reflected in the life, probably best reflected in the life of Theodore Parker. For Parker, this work of understanding self and understanding God, while individual, was not a selfish or self-centered exercise. For him, a natural outcome of our understanding of God would be fidelity to God's law, right relationship among God's creation, what you today might call justice. Parker believed that we are held by God and we are accountable to God, and what that accountability looks like is the creation of justice. It was Parker's abiding belief in God and belief in that accountability to God and by extension to each other that animated what we know of his call to justice. Parker was a lifelong and active abolitionist. He was a leader in the resistance to the fugitive slave law, which demanded that citizens be complicit in capturing escaped enslaved people and returning them to bondage. Parker operated part of the Underground Railroad and is reputed to have written his sermons with a loaded pistol at hand as he harbored people escaping slavery and hiding from hunters. You perhaps have heard Theodore Parker paraphrased: "The arc of the universe is long, and it bends toward justice." More fully, Parker wrote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is long, is a long one. My eye reacheth but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can only divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." Though he could not claim to fully understand the moral universe, Parker made it his work to try to divine what he could by conscience. While we may remember that a goal of the Transcendentalists was to know oneself in order to have a closer relationship to God, Theodore Parker reminds us that a closer relationship to God must be in the service of God's law, justice. Wherever you find God, wherever you think to look for God, in the grass, in the night, in the mystery, in the lives of your neighbors, in your very own heart, may you carry with you the earnest faith and devotion of our Transcendentalist ancestors. May you shine it out in your own acts of devotion and service.